Today I'm going to give you a brief overview of PTSD, very brief, and then I'm also going to talk about something that I am researching and doing work around, which is something that I've coined as transition stress. California teacher under fire for calling military personnel the lowest of the low. They're not like high-level thinkers. They're not academic people. They're not intellectual people. They're the freakiest lowest of the low. They're not talented people. Does anybody remember this? Just a couple months ago. More recently? Yesterday. Mike Murphy's memorial on Long Island was vandalized. Right? It was by a 14-year-old, so we can have conversations around context and age, but there's something happening here, right? Maybe something sociological, maybe something culturally, maybe something that we don't quite understand yet between military personnel and civilian personnel. So what is the current state of our veteran affairs? More than 1.7 million of the 2.6 million service members that served in Iraq and Afghanistan have transitioned back to civilian life, with more than 1 million expected to do so over the next 5 years. As such, we do not know the full psychological impact of the global war on terror. We just don't know because it hasn't been fully realized because the war's not over yet. And it's difficult to identify and track discrete groups. So people that have served are still serving, transitioned out whether it was a year ago or transitioned out 10 years ago, right? They all have very, very different experiences, but the way that we currently structure the military and veteran affairs, we can't communicate between the two. So identifying these groups, tracking them so that we can treat them and research them is next to impossible. And despite the fact that we have no idea what's going on, the majority of our interventions, the majority of our psychological treatments narrowly focus on psychopathology, meaning the kind of extreme expression of psychological distress. And the majority of it is centered around post-traumatic stress disorder. So the current state of veteran treatment, like I just said, oriented around PTSD. So transitioning veterans who may have PTSD or who may not have PTSD don't seek services for fear either they don't qualify, for fear of stigma, for fear of their treatment preference being in conflict of what's being offered, because currently the VA offers and prioritizes 2 treatments, prolonged exposure and cognitive processing therapy. These 2 types of therapies are firmly oriented in trauma. So during your first session, you go in and you have to share your most traumatic experiences with practically a stranger in order for them to kind of crystallize and structure how the treatment's going to progress. PE and CPT are prioritized by the VA, they're typically offered first, and they're tracked by institutional measures, meaning that the providers are expected and then their performance is awarded based upon their delivering of these 2 treatments. And the majority that partake in these treatments, whether it's prolonged exposure or cognitive processing therapy, they continue to suffer elevated symptoms and they drop out. So what is the prevalence rate? How many people have PTSD? So, not that many. However, it's about 10%. There are studies that show anywhere from 4.9 to the upper limits about 20%. Now, we can get in a conversation about empiricism and research methods and how we're measuring PTSD, but kind of the most methodologically rigorous studies, the ones that are looking at it in really complex ways, that are gathering baseline data and following these veterans over a period of time, it's really about 10%. But if you remember that first slide, 2.6 million served in Iraq and Afghanistan. 10% of that is still 260,000 service members. So I want to make sure that as we have this conversation, this is not to stigmatize or to discount the experience of PTSD. PTSD is insidious and it very much exists within our population. The issue becomes when we kind of convolute the conversation and assume that any veteran that shows up for treatment has PTSD solely because they're a veteran. So what is PTSD? Well, it's a mental health problem that typically arises from having encountered or witnessed a life-threatening situation. And it's a cluster of symptoms, and the way that we now diagnose it is oriented around kind of 4 domains. So you have reliving the experience. So typically you think of nightmares and flashbacks, avoidance symptoms, so avoiding any sort of reminder of the trauma itself. Noises, movies, places, smells, things like that. Negative beliefs and feelings, cognition, so feeling shame, feeling bad about yourself, thinking that you don't deserve to live, why wasn't it me? Those are another kind of cluster of symptoms. And then hyperarousal reactivity. So, an increased startle reflex typically falls into that category. But you have to have an endorsement of 6 symptoms to be diagnosed with PTSD. And that's not 6 symptoms across all 4 of those domains. It's 1 from the first one, so 1 reliving the event symptom, 1 from the avoidance symptom kind of tree, 2 from negative beliefs and feelings, and 2 from hypoarousal and activity. And after that, you then have to endorse significant functional impairment and the persistence of the symptoms in excess of 1 month. So this is a conversation we're having at breakfast. I think we need to normalize that after exposure to a traumatic event, initially, you're going to potentially have all of those. You're going to have nightmares. You're going to have hyperarousal. You're going to have an increased reactivity because that's normal post-reaction to a traumatic experience. It's when it persists after a period of month and causes this significant functional impairment that from a diagnostic perspective, we begin to look at something like PTSD. But there's significant overlap with other symptoms and other diagnoses. Depression, for example, so anhedonia, this like lack of desire to do something. Well, that falls in a lot of different diagnoses within psychology itself. So yes, it could be PTSD and it could be something else. And in fact, it's very amorphous. You can have 636,120 different ways to have PTSD, taking all those symptoms into consideration. So PTSD looks different in everyone, right? But the problem is our model looks at it as a binary. You either have it or you don't. We don't quite conceptualize it as a continuum. But no matter what, we make the assumption that if you show up and you're experiencing any of that, it's rooted in trauma. But then what is transition stress? We're talking about PTSD, then what's transition stress? Well, it's some level of psychological dysfunction or distress that results from a service member leaving active duty and transitioning into civilian society. But it's not a diagnosis, okay? This is not something you'll find in the DSM. It's not a diagnosis. It's just some level of stress. What causes it? We don't know, right? As JD was saying, we're going to have more questions than we have answers. No idea what causes it. We just know that it's there. Why does it matter? Well, we have been talking about it for 15 years recently, but also as JD was saying, we've been talking about it from a historical perspective forever. There's something happening here. So it's not just PTSD, there's something else. So how prevalent is it then? Well, from a Pew population study, we know that it occurs about 44 to 72% of veterans. This is high levels of transition stress. That is almost ubiquitous. So 10% PTSD, 72% high levels of stress transitioning out. And this can be in employment, this can be in relationships with people, this can be in relationships with people at work. There are a variety of ways that transition stress can manifest. And the struggle for our generation of veterans, for the global war on terror generation of veterans, transition stress is reported at higher levels for them than any other generation of veterans or the times in between. And it's been found to predict treatment seeking and physical and mental health problems and suicidal ideation. And the majority of first suicide attempts occur post-transition. How many veterans do we have in here? Is everybody served? Do we have some? Okay. So most of you, but we'll go through this real fast. Usually I'm giving this to people who have very little experience with the military, so I have to explain like what BCT is or what advanced combat training is, but we go through basic training, right? Some form of basic training, whether it was from an officer side, whether from an enlisted perspective, we go through some socialization process. The military spends billions of dollars taking a civilian, putting them through training to create a service member. All right? And then we reinforce it, we socialize it, we do other training events, we deploy, we reinforce these concepts that we introduce from day one, and again and again and again, tell our service members why they matter, or why it's important. And then we increase the level of training, right? So you start at a very basic, it's called basic training for a reason, you start at a basic level, you get advanced training, and then you get like kind of complementary training, right? You begin to go to higher level courses as you progress throughout your military career. This increases confidence, but it also crystallizes your identity. And it typically happens during a period of what psychologists refer to as emerging adulthood. This is the age most people enter the military. About 48% of our current military force falls in that age range, 18 to 25. And it's during this period that we begin asking ourselves, and not just us, not just military members, everyone, civilians, everyone who is 18 to 25 asks themselves in some capacity these questions, whether it's on a college campus, whether it's on your first job, whether it's at basic training. What kind of work am I good for? Who am I? What do I believe in? Where do I fit in? And because of this period, for cognitive reasons, for neurological reasons, these things become very crystallized, very hardened. So we arrive at enduring choices. This is what I believe in. These are the values that I have. So during a very normative period of self-exploration, the military tells you all those things. They tell you what you value. You value duty, honor, country. You value, what's the Marine one? Do we have any Marines in here? God, core, country, inspire yourself to serve, selfless service, leadership, all of that. The military tells you that that's what matters. And for a variety of reasons, we believe it, either because that's our natural personality predisposition, but then it's reinforced. So yes, we kind of tilt maybe that way naturally, but then it's reinforced, so it becomes even more salient. But then when we leave, some of that doesn't make sense anymore, right? So you have what we call identity diffusion, which is where you had this really crystallized identity that made sense, that was adaptable to your situation, was a good fit, no longer is a good fit. So you can have contradictory character traits. So things that served you really well, whether it was being stoic or maybe potentially being a little bit more confrontational and aggressive, no longer serve you well in a new context. You could have this kind of discontinuation of self. Like, okay, well, all these things that matter to me, selfless service, leadership, all of that no longer necessarily has a place in a cubicle or behind a computer, or as you're trying to figure out what you want to do, maybe you're a barista, or maybe you're sitting in a classroom as a freshman, and you're 44 and your classmates are 18. A lack of authenticity. What do I have to offer? Does it matter? Does anybody want to know my experience? Does it matter? What I do, does that matter? Feelings of emptiness. Right? We were talking about that cluster of symptomatology before for PTSD. Emptiness is one of them. It's also a symptom of depression, but it could also just be a transient state as you're trying to establish a new identity. Gender dysphoria, so this typically what I mean here in this context is around masculinity. We socialize masculinity, and this does not confer gender, okay? So I want to make sure we disentangle that. This means that we prize masculinity in the military, and by masculinity I mean stoicism, self-control, autonomy, aggressiveness. We prize that in the military, and once again, we socialize it. So when you go out into a civilian context, it no longer values those in kind of the same way or has differing concepts of what that mean. It can cause significant levels of distress. And your ethic and moral kind of relativism, how you see the world, can be in conflict. So all of this relates back to identity. So this identity that you crystallized in the military no longer looks the same, or if it looks the same, no longer fits. And you wonder, where do I fit in? Other considerations, so again, this is a quick overview. There's lots of things happening. We have grief over people that we've left behind. And I don't mean just fallen comrades here. I also want to say that a lot of service members experience getting out of the fight and leaving their friends behind to continue doing that. There is significant guilt and shame around that. And that's normative. And I want us to make sure that we have a conversation around that. So it's not just about the people that you've lost. It's about the people you've left behind. Role transition, you were maybe the breadwinner, now you're going to be a student. And the GI Bill is great, but it's not that great. So you can lose that context. Nostalgia. Nostalgia is a protective factor, right? It's remembering all the things that made your service great. But if it kind of gets out of order, if that's all you're doing, if all kind of you're sitting around being like, I was the best I was ever going to be. Like the best I ever was going to be was jumping out of planes. Well, then that's a problem if you're 25 and you have your whole life ahead of you. Moral injury, something JD touched upon. Shame around maybe the institution betraying you. Maybe your transition out wasn't exactly what you wanted. Maybe you had to sign out in the middle of the night. Confusion about civilian-military differences. Stereotype threat. I think there's a lot of, we talk a lot, Melissa and I've had a lot of conversations about stereotypes. There's a lot of perpetuating stereotypes and myths around service. And again, socialized masculinity. So what are we doing about this, right? It's not a disorder. What is it? People don't really hear about it. This is kind of a new concept that's emerging. So what are we doing about it? Well, so where I'm at right now, we've partnered with Walter Reed Army Institute of Research to measure this. So we can actually leverage empiricism. So we can go to Soldier for Life Transition Assistant Programming. How many people did the Soldier for Life Transition Program? I did too. It was a week when they were like, here's how you write a resume. Here's a day you dress for success. I was like, this is useless for me. This is not at all what I need. But there's nothing leveraged towards the cognitive, psychological, or emotional impact of service, right? So again, was it billions of dollars are spent turning you from a civilian to a military member? $0 are spent attempting from a psychological, emotional, and cognitive perspective, transitioning you from a military member back to a civilian. We're doing semi-structured interviews, we're adapting new therapies to try to capture this in a variety of different ways so that we can affect programming. So what can you do, all right? This, I think, is the most important thing. Well, you are all already ahead of the game. So much of things is giving words to things, giving words matter, right? So understanding this may happen, it's once again, not a diagnosis, it's an experience. So you may have some levels of distress around any of the things I talked about or none of them. But the important thing is anticipate, all right? So what may it feel like to sit in a classroom with someone you have no shared commonality with? How do you become a human being to that person, and how is that person a human being to you? Develop strategies. Where can you meet on common ground? Or where can you find common ground? And then adjust them, because they may not work. You may get there, you may try something, and it doesn't work for you. So be flexible. Find ways to readapt, which is something we're all very good at. Readapt yourself to meet that demand. And if it gets a little out of whack, ask for help. All right, so you can show up. There are thousands of resources. I'm happy to provide them to anybody that asks. Ask for help so it doesn't go any further down that path. Thank you very much.
That was amazing. That was amazing. And to sort of carry on and start this conversation, Melissa, I'm actually going to ask you, just what are your sort of initial reactions to Megan's presentation, right? In terms of either the prevalence or the depiction of PTSD or the emergence in this, asking this question of transition stress and the many life transitions that we all go through.
Well, I think what really resonated with me was this idea of the identity crisis when you are transitioning and how much you question yourself. I know showing up at Yale Medical School when I took off the uniform 3 years ago, I was coming into what I knew to be an extremely liberal environment. They'd only let ROTC back on campus within the past few years after having not allowed them since the Vietnam era. And along with what was mentioned yesterday in one of the rooms talking about gender, how females are a lot less likely to identify as a veteran. So for me, it was, as I was meeting new people, it's, do I even tell people I was in the Army? How do I take on that burden of having to explain to people, when those questions inevitably come of, oh, you've been to Iraq, what was that like? And to be able to answer those questions. So is it more, I just keep it to myself, like what's my role, where do I fall? And having lived through some of those exact questions you're talking about was pretty interesting.
Yeah, and Megan, your reactions or thoughts on that?
No, I very much agree, and that's something that we see a lot. It is, how am I going to approach these questions? Do you even self-identify as a veteran? Like, there were some people I asked if they were a veteran, and I was like, maybe I am now. I don't know. Like, do I put my hand up? Do I put my hand down? Because some of us just don't want to identify as that anymore. Some of us want to fully leave that behind. So very much it's figuring out how can you integrate your two identities, right? So yes, you were a military member, you're a veteran, but now you're not. So how do you integrate the two and ask those questions? And if somebody doesn't ask you those questions, ask them for yourself so that you can answer them. So if it does happen, you're prepared, but also it'll allow you to fully kind of flesh out all those different areas that maybe you weren't attending to.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. One of the slides that really struck me, if we could go to Megan's slide that said other considerations on that particular title. I guess when you're talking about like some of those different factors that go into that, I was wondering if you could highlight that a little bit more and just maybe explain what you think, which factors are probably most influential in sort of determining if that transition stress will start to manifest or potentially how and when.
So I want to make sure, so I am a firm believer, and Melissa and I again had this conversation about making sure that we say that I don't have all the answers. Hands down, like I'm not 100% sure. I have a lot of theory. I have a lot of kind of anecdotal experience because I see veterans in therapy, but in terms of the research, we're not quite sure yet. But what I've mostly seen, at least on veterans on campus, so if we're talking from a student context, it is what you were just saying, this kind of disconnect between civilian life and military life. Also, civilians don't call themselves civilians, right? So we call ourselves veterans. So that's already something right there, like starting off. Like they don't go around being like, nice to meet you, I'm a civilian. We're already, kind of 1 foot out the door in that respect. So I think the biggest thing though is finding commonality, finding common ground. So not to get too political, it's scary for everyone, I think, but politics right now is definitely in the forefront, and the military force is slightly more, well, it's not slightly, it is more conservative than the average American, broadly speaking. Of course, there's going to be variability in that. But college campuses right now are much more liberal. And the conflict of that I have seen in, at times, almost devastating ways. The day after the election, Columbia established safe rooms and cried out rooms because some people were very distressed about the results of the election. And I had to staff these rooms as a mental health provider. And then I was doing processing therapy with a former Ranger Regiment guy who had lost his friend. It was an anniversary reaction. And we were doing processing around him having to pick the brains of his friend out of his kit, right? So in 1 minute I'm with, young men and women that are crying because of the election. And the next minute I'm sitting with a veteran who is processing something that is extraordinarily traumatic, right? And then in a couple hours they would be sitting in the same classroom. And that disparity, I've seen be very, very challenging for some young veterans.
Right, yeah, and in your point of stress that can sometimes come with anniversaries of a number of different things, and that could be something that we might think is innocuous as a goodbye, or something obviously as traumatic of a loss of a comrade. I think that makes so much sense when you think about your point of anticipation. And I think it's very, very important. And both of your comments, I think, are also very interesting and nest in with a discussion that Andrea presented during one of the on-conference sessions yesterday, where she was just strongly encouraging the civic importance of veterans in that academic piece. Yeah. And I think it sends such a strong message when one of us, right, has the ability to clearly communicate in terms of not just saying something, but employing the mouth and the ears in the ratio that they exist physically on your body, right? Of listening as much as part of that public discourse, which is so ardently missing in so many discussions. Now, Melissa, you've actually worked with our communications team on potentially crafting and writing about this, and working on a potential op-ed about the prevalence of what we can, roughly call the PTSD narrative. I was curious, or at least the media's role in perpetuating that narrative. What inspired you to write, to potentially seek out that particular venue on the pervasiveness of these, again, timely and timeless sort of topics?
Right. So I was in an op-ed workshop this past spring, and they explained to you to write about what you're annoyed about or what really irks you. And at the time, the news story had just come out. There was the Southwest Airlines incident where a woman was tragically killed, partially pulled out of the window. And within, I want to say it was like 11 days after the event, another news story came out that one of the passengers who was sitting in a few rows behind that woman had filed a lawsuit alleging PTSD and depression because of the events. And it irked me because now being in medical school and understanding the diagnosis and how it persists, as Megan was mentioning, the typical stress reaction that can eventually resolve, it does take over 30 days to receive a PTSD diagnosis. And I was like, it's only been 11 days. She can't possibly have PTSD. But at the same time, I didn't fault her or lawyers or anyone else for that, because as I reflected, I said, we always hear about PTSD. That is like the only thing you hear about. And I can totally understand why the assumption would be, if you experience a traumatic event, you're going to get PTSD. So anyone experiencing some of these mass shootings, and you would think that everybody is going to wind up with PTSD. And my reflections came from a point of personal experience where, because of being in the military and having all these classes, the suicide prevention, the PTSD, and for all good intents and purposes, we needed to understand, we needed to start fighting the stigma and trying to get people help. However, for me, it meant that was all I was hearing about, and I thought that was the expectation. To just talk a little bit about my story, I deployed for the first time 2005, 2006 to Iraq prior to the surge, and our brigade suffered quite a number of losses. I would go out, not very often from the FOB, doing medical missions, but I was in a vehicle that got hit by an IED. I was in another scenario where a vehicle in front of mine got hit when other people were killed and wounded in that attack. So by all intents and purposes, if I were to fill out one of those combat exposure scales, I would score pretty moderate as far as witnessing and experiencing traumatic events. And my husband was also deployed with me at the time, and he suffered, loss of his friends and he got hit by an IED as well. So we would kind of reflect after that deployment and talk to each other and say, why is it that we don't have PTSD and some of our soldiers do? Like, what's the difference? Like, how come we don't have PTSD? And then later on in my life, about 3.5 years ago now, after his 4th deployment and he had transitioned to the reserves, my husband was tragically killed in an avalanche in Colorado. So a really sudden event. And for me at the time, I was, had the nightmares, had, some of the initial stress responses. And I was like, well, this is it. Of course I'm gonna get PTSD now. If I were to have one of those lifetime exposure scales, I check a whole lot of boxes. Of course I'm gonna get PTSD. And then within a couple weeks, I was back at work. I was getting up every morning, still functioning, and I'm like, wait a minute, I don't have PTSD. And it was really a struggle in my identity and going through therapy of, why don't I have PTSD? Am I not good enough? Did I not love him enough? It's like, shouldn't I have PTSD? Like, it was like this desired, end state. And I think part of it was that would have helped me validate my experience. And having that, contrast of, and realizing now, and as I've started to work on this op-ed and research in the, let's take the civilian population, we just talked about the veteran population, but in a lifetime, it's estimated between 50 to 90% of the populace will experience some sort of traumatic life event that could potentially qualify to result in PTSD. And of those 50 to 90% who experience a lifetime event, 6.8% of them, so we can call it 7%, will move on to develop PTSD. So a little bit lower rate than what we talked about with the veterans, which could be up to 20% in combat veterans. But still, if you were to just go by what the media says, movies, whatever, you would assume that of these, kids in the school shootings, Las Vegas shootings, that the majority of them are going to wind up with PTSD. And the truth is, when you truly understand natural stress reactions and then what persists and is actually diagnosed as PTSD, it's less than 10%. So I think really trying to understand, to be able to provide resources and the right treatments and everything for those who actually fall in that 10%, but also to still validate the experiences of the other 90% is a key battle.
Yeah, well, Melissa, Megan, thank you so very much for information, for insight, for stories. It was incredible. Thank you very, very much.